So welcome. Today's class is Beginning Jewish Genealogy, and my name is Josiah Schmidt. I am a reference specialist in the History and Genealogy Department at St. Louis County Library. And I would like to let everybody know that this class or some version of it will be recorded and made available on the St. Louis County Library website and on the library's YouTube channel sometime in the future. It may take us up to a few weeks, so we will thank you in advance for being patient with us. This class is being presented as a Zoom webinar. We will not be utilizing the chat or the hand raise features in this particular webinar, so please feel free to ask questions by clicking on the Q&A icon and typing your question or comment. If there is an urgent question or comment about a technical difficulty that is occurring, I will try to address that as it happens. Otherwise, for questions regarding Jewish genealogy, I will answer those questions at the end of this session. Now, I did want to also make you aware, for those of you who enjoy attending virtual programs from the St. Louis County Library History and Genealogy Department, we have a couple of other virtual programs that are coming up. So one of them is on October 3rd. That is a virtual program on Exploring Ancestry Library Edition. That will be from 2 p.m. until 3 p.m. on October 3rd. And then there is another one a little sooner on September 28th, and that will be an introduction to Mexican genealogy. So if there are any folks here with Sephardic Jewish ancestry, that may be something that could be helpful for your research in that regard. So that will be 11 a.m. on September 28th, which is a Saturday. And we would also love to welcome you to our brand new space in the Clark Family Branch Library. It is located at 1640 South Lindbergh Boulevard in Ladue in St. Louis County. And our Emerson History and Genealogy Center is on the second floor of that Clark Family Branch Library. So for those of you who remember our old library headquarters and the History and Genealogy Center that had been on the 5th floor of that previous building, that old building was torn down a couple of years ago. And this new building that we are currently inhabiting is in the exact same location as the old building. So if you remember how to get to the old library headquarters from up until a couple of years ago, you can go to that same location now and you will see this beautiful new space. So getting into beginning Jewish genealogy, I would like to start by offering you all a bit of an outline about the topics that we are going to discuss tonight. So first, I am going to provide a bit of historical background about the history of Jewish people, and specifically as it pertains to those Jewish people who immigrated to the United States. And then I am going to encourage us, as we begin doing Jewish genealogy, to start close to home here in the United States. So looking at records that were generated regarding our ancestors domestically here in the United States, or even here in St. Louis. And then after we have gone over records that will be pertinent to your parents, your grandparents, and your most immediate ancestors and relatives here in America, we will jump the pond, so to speak, and increasingly talk about records that will be relevant for researching Jewish ancestors outside of the United States. And then lastly, I would like to leave you all with some tips and tricks about how to break through what we call genealogical brick walls. Walls in your family history research where you are unable to progress any further back. You have hit a brick wall and you need some new resources or perspectives to see if you can break even further back and find information about ancestors further back in your tree. So many of you who are on this webinar are probably familiar with the term Pale of Settlement. So the Pale of Settlement, for those of you who are not familiar, was an area encompassing Eastern Europe and areas of Western ethnically Russian or Russian-speaking lands where Jewish individuals were confined to live. So you can see on this map that is dated from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, the Pale of Settlement includes much of what we today would call Poland, Ukraine, Western Russia, and it extends up to the coast of the Baltic Sea. And you will notice that back in the 19th century, the borders of Germany actually extended quite a ways along the southern coast of the Baltic Sea. The borders do not extend that far east today. Today, we would be looking at the Baltic countries and Poland there, but at the time, that was the border between Germany and Poland. And this is where a lot of Jewish people, especially Ashkenazi Jewish people who immigrated to the United States, this is where they resided during this point in time. There were a few different waves of migration that took Jewish individuals from old world locations to the so-called New World. The first major wave took place in the 18th century when Sephardic Jews immigrated from the Iberian Peninsula after they were expelled from Iberia in 1492 and had gone to places all along the southern Mediterranean coast of Europe into places like Turkey and Central Asia. Many of those Sephardic Jews immigrated to South America, especially to regions of South America like Brazil, and then from South America immigrated further north to what was at the time the British colonies in North America. You can see on the map to your left some of these very early Sephardic Jewish settlements in British North America. So we have New York City with a Jewish community formed there in 1730, Savannah, Georgia, 1734, Philadelphia, 1740, Charleston, South Carolina, 1750, Newport, Rhode Island, 1763. And these initial Sephardic immigrants were supplemented by Ashkenazi immigrants who also started immigrating to the British North American colonies in the 1700s. The second major wave of Jewish immigration to the United States took place from the 1820s to the 1880s. And these were largely Ashkenazic Jewish individuals and largely originating in Central Europe. And they were immigrating partially in response to the new freedoms of Jewish emancipation, which allowed Jews to be much more mobile, but also partially in response to the pogroms and the persecutions that emancipation sparked. So non-Jewish individuals living in places like Europe and Western Asia saw Jewish emancipation as a threat, and that caused some increase in persecutions and pogroms that also spurred many Ashkenazi Jewish people to immigrate in the mid-19th century. We have our third major wave of Jewish immigration to the United States taking place from the 1880s until the 1920s. And again, this is also primarily Ashkenazi Jewish people, but these Jewish people from the 1880s to the 1920s are mostly originating in Eastern Europe, especially that Pale of Settlement that we saw in the previous slide. They were immigrating to the United States for a host of different reasons, including the effects of industrialization, population increase in Eastern Europe, pogroms, banishment of Jews from major Russian cities, and also many Jewish individuals fleeing the 1905 Russian Revolution. And then lastly, the fourth wave of Jewish emigration to the United States consisted largely of refugees from fascism and refugees from the Holocaust. Now, when it comes to researching your Jewish ancestor, we always recommend to our patrons that they start with themselves. Start with what you know yourself. And we have included in the email that hopefully all of you who are registered for this event received earlier today, not only an outline of today's presentation, but also a blank PDF family tree chart where you can write down your own name on the far left side of that chart. And then you will see branching off from that entry a space for your father, and below that a space for your mother. And then your paternal entry will also branch off into a space for your father's father, a space for your father's mother, and then the same for your mother. You'll see on that chart on the third column over spaces for your mother's father and your mother's mother. And beneath each space on that family tree chart, you will see a bullet list of spaces for different types of information about that individual. So you will see a B and a W for when and where was this individual born, an M for when was this individual married, and a D and W for when and where did this individual die. And we encourage everyone when they're starting their Jewish genealogy research to put in as much information as they already know. And if there are any pieces of information that you don't know, that is okay, because you can use the pieces of information you do know to kind of triangulate those pieces of information that you don't know. And we also encourage everyone to look into oral history first to get your initial leads and clues and hints about where to go with your genealogy research. It's always helpful to start by asking what historical interviews have already been done. Perhaps your ancestors or people from your ancestral communities have already been interviewed by one of the many different oral history recording projects that are out there. And I have included in the handout that you hopefully received via email today links to some of the different websites that have been recording Jewish oral histories. Many oral histories have been recorded in physical book form, and you can find some of them here at St. Louis County Library H&G, or History and Genealogy Center. And then for those individuals who have not been interviewed yet or have not been interviewed thoroughly enough, we really encourage everyone to interview your oldest living relatives right away while it is still possible. So think about, who are your oldest living relatives? Now, even if your parents or your grandparents have already passed away, think if your parents or your grandparents have any cousins who are still living, any siblings who are still living, close friends of theirs who are still living. For instance, I am fortunate enough to have an 85-year-old grandfather who's still living, and he has a 95-year-old aunt who is still living. So although I can no longer interview my great-grandfather, my grandfather's father, I can still interview my great-grandfather's sister-in-law, somebody from the same generation as my great-grandfather. So think in terms of, who are the oldest living relatives in your entire family tree? Also think in terms of, who are the oldest living members of your synagogue community? So in my synagogue, we have several members who are well into their 90s in terms of age and have very sharp memories and very long memories and have all kinds of fascinating stories about what it was like to live in Jewish communities in St. Louis 80, 90 years ago. So oftentimes, even if these people are not in your family tree, they are still alive and they are still willing to tell you maybe about members of your family who they knew, or stories about the community in which your ancestors lived. And then once you find those individuals whom you can interview for oral history, can those individuals put you in touch with other long-lived interviewees who might give you some valuable information, stories, or memories that are relevant to your family history. And St. Louis County Library, H&G, would be happy to help with that. So I am actually currently recording this webinar from what's called our memory lab. So our memory lab here at the new History and Genealogy Center consists of two separate rooms. One room is our scanning and digitization studio, where you can bring in family photographs, family documents, family books, family videos in VHS form or 8mm film reel form, and a few other different formats. You can bring those in and get our help with digitizing those into MP4 formats or MP3 formats for audio, or JPEG or TIFF formats for images and photographs. Now, the second room that's part of our memory lab is this room that I'm in right now. And here you can see a photograph of that room. So this is called our Personal History Recording Studio. And this is a space designated and specialized for doing oral history recording. So you can see we have a very comfortable couch where you can sit on the couch in front of a webcam, and you can record either yourself giving your life story or talking about your memories, or you can bring in an older relative and interview them side by side, asking them questions about what they remember, getting their life story. You will want to, if you're planning to visit us and use the memory lab, you will want to bring a storage device of some type. We usually recommend a USB flash drive that you can plug into the computer to store the video file, to store the audio file, to store the images, whatever you're digitizing. Here in our personal history recording studio, we also have these very convenient prompts. So prompt questions, things that you can answer yourself or questions that you can ask your interviewee whom you have brought in. So we have these 4 different collections of question cards, one about childhood memories, one about formative events from early adulthood, one about historical events that an individual has lived through and what they remember of those events, and then one about what individuals remember of their previous generations. So you could bring in an older relative and ask them questions of what they remember of their parents or their grandparents or even great-grandparents. So that acts as kind of a genealogical slingshot, asking 80-year-olds what they remember of when they were children, talking to people who were at that time 80 years old. So in that way, for instance, I have interviewed relatives of mine who were in my great-grandparents' generation. And she, for instance, had firsthand memories of people in her great-grandparents' generation. So firsthand memories of my great-great-great-grandparents. So this is the power of oral history. And it's also why oral history is so important for Jewish researchers. And then here is an image of the large screen touch screen, which is in our personal history recording studio. Very easy and simple user face. You either touch the green button to record video, or you can touch the red button to record audio only. And then if you would like, we have an in-person program called Exploring the Memory Lab, which will be given at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, September 17th, here at the Clark Family Branch. You do need to register in advance for that because there is limited space. Now, if you go to register for this event and it's all filled up, keep checking back, because these more popular programs that fill up quickly, we will continue to offer new sessions of these programs in coming weeks and months. So if this one fills up, just keep checking back, and you may very well see another instance of this program being offered in the coming weeks or months. Now, the most important genealogy repositories that researchers are using these days are websites like Ancestry. Normally with Ancestry.com, you would have to get your own account and pay for it. And for very hardcore researchers, that might be worth it for you. But for a lot of researchers, especially those who are beginning their genealogy research, we recommend using our free version of Ancestry, which is called Ancestry Library Edition. Now, you do have to be inside of one of our St. Louis County Library buildings in order to use this free version, but you can be inside of any St. Louis County Library building, whichever branch is closest to you. It does not need to be here in the History and Genealogy Center or at the Clark Family branch. And it can be on either a library computer, or you can bring in your own laptop or device. As long as you are connected to library Wi-Fi, you will be able to access Ancestry Library Edition for free. And to get to Ancestry Library Edition, once you are in one of our buildings, you will go to our library website, which you can see in the upper left corner of the screen in the URL bar. It's slcl.org. So that stands for St. Louis County Library, slcl.org. Then turn your attention to this little search function in the upper right corner of the website, where it has a long rectangle with two bubbles underneath it. So by default, the catalog bubble will be checked, but catalog refers to the physical books in our collections. So you'll want to click the bubble for website, which allows you to search our web-based resources. And then immediately above the bubble that says website, you'll type into that rectangle there the words Ancestry Library. And when you run that search, the first search result that appears will be called Ancestry Library Edition, St. Louis County Library. So you will click that, and on the resulting page, you'll see it reminds you that this is for in-library use only. So you have to be in one of our buildings, but you will just click this big blue Go to Resource button, and it will take you to ancestrylibrary.com. Now, ancestrylibrary.com has all of the same sources that ancestry.com has. The main difference is that you will not be able to build a digital family tree on ancestrylibrary.com like you would if you paid the money to have your own personal Ancestry account. But you can still access and download all the historical sources from this free ancestrylibrary.com. Once you get to ancestrylibrary.com, most people will click search in this menu bar at the top of the website. And then in the resulting drop-down menu, they will usually go ahead and click all collections. So that will search census records, vital records, military records, immigration records, everything. The other main digital repository for doing genealogy research that we love to hook patrons up with is FamilySearch.org. FamilySearch is very similar to Ancestry, but FamilySearch has some records that Ancestry doesn't have, while Ancestry has some records that FamilySearch doesn't have. When you get onto FamilySearch.org, it's totally free. You can access it from anywhere, including from home. You do just need to create a free personal FamilySearch.org account, and that button will be in the upper right corner of their website. But once you get onto FamilySearch.org and you are logged in, just like on Ancestry, we recommend people click search in the menu at the top of the website. But then in the resulting drop-down menu, you will benefit, I think, from clicking catalog. And here's why. So when you go to the catalog search page on Family Search, you can type in a geographic locale. In this instance, I have typed in United States, comma, Missouri, comma, St. Louis, and then you can click the blue search button to run the search, and it will show you all of the different sources and records that are available for that location. So in what you can see here, you can see that they have biographies of people who lived in St. Louis, cemetery records, censuses. This is a screenshot, but if you could scroll down, you would also see things like directories, city and county directories. You would see immigration and naturalization records. You would see military records, tax records, land and property records, vital records, etc. So this is a great way to access all the records for a geographic area. And it doesn't have to be St. Louis. You could type in the name of a town in Poland or Germany or Brazil or Argentina, and you will be able to find all of the records that Family Search has collected for that location. Now, getting into the different categories of records that you can use when you are starting out your genealogy research. After you have written down what you already know and you have spoken with your oldest living family members and members of your community, we recommend patrons begin with censuses. So censuses show snapshots of households in a given moment of time. Federal censuses were conducted by the United States government every 10 years. So from the founding of the United States in the late 1700s, all the way up until 2020 was the most recent census, the US government has conducted this enumeration of what they've attempted to do is count every single human being who lives in the United States. Now, only up to the 1950 census is currently publicly available. So the 1960 census will not become available for public viewing for another several years. And also, unfortunately, the 1890 census was totally lost in a fire many decades ago. So unfortunately, the 1890 census records do not exist. So you will be able to find 1860, 70, 80, then 1900, 10, 20, and so on. And these records will often show you names, ages of individuals, and other biographical details. And then also some states, not all, but some states conducted their own state censuses. And these state censuses were often conducted 5 years removed from federal censuses. So for certain states, depending on where your ancestors lived, you might find censuses for 1895, 1905, 15, 25, 35. These censuses are generally available on ancestry.com and familysearch.org. Now, here's an example of what a census record looks like. So you can see starting at the left that this individual has a house number of 5838, and the name of the street is often written vertically along the left, but that is cut off in this screenshot, unfortunately. But their house number is 5838. They are the 41st household that this particular census worker enumerated inside of this census district. The head of household here is an individual named Wolf Diamond. It says that he is the head of household. He is of white race, of male sex, 43 years old. It says that he is married. It says that he was born in Poland. Gives some information about his employment situation and his education. It states that he is a butcher by occupation and that his industry is meat market. And then below Wolf, it lists his wife, Regina, and their 3 sons, Benjamin, Itzich, and Henrik. Now, for those of you who don't know, Wolf Diamond here was one of the business partners of Simon Cohn, who was the founder of the, unfortunately now late, great Cohn's Kosher Deli of St. Louis. Another excellent resource for finding ancestors, especially ancestors in St. Louis, are directories, both city and county directories. So these are kind of the predecessors to what we know today as white pages or yellow pages. Directories usually had a section listing the names and also sometimes the occupations of residents alongside their street addresses. Sometimes, depending on the year, because in different years, the companies who produced these books formatted the books in different ways. They changed the formatting over time. Sometimes these were organized alphabetically by last name, regardless of what street somebody lived on. And at other times, these were organized alphabetically by street name. So you would find Big Bend Boulevard ahead of Lindbergh Boulevard, for instance. And often these directories also have a section listing all the businesses in the city or county. And these are almost always organized alphabetically by type of business. So you're going to find all the banks before all the carpentry businesses. And all the carpentry businesses will be before all the dentistry businesses, and so on. These records are generally available on sites like Ancestry, Family Search. Some St. Louis directories are available on a website called fold3.com, which we also provide you free access to through the library website. And you can also find some physical copies of these directories in person if you come see us at St. Louis County Library H&G. And here's an example of what one of the St. Louis city directories look like. So this is a listing of people with the last name of Hirschfeld in the 1904 St. Louis city directory. And I will draw your attention to Isaac Hirschfeld in the center of the image there. So Isaac Hirschfeld is the father of Al Hirschfeld. And I don't know how many of you know this, but Al Hirschfeld, after he and his parents moved to New York City, Al became a very famous caricaturist who was best known for his black and white portraits of celebrities and Broadway stars. And so he got his start here in St. Louis. You can also find immigration and naturalization records. So different types of immigration records are available online. You might first be able to find passenger manifest lists. In the 1800s and early 1900s, these are almost always ship passenger lists. As you get further into the 20th century, you will start to find on websites like Ancestry some airplane passenger lists, particularly if they're coming from overseas. But mainly, most of us here will be looking at ship passenger lists. Then you can also find, if that person pursued US citizenship, what is called declarations of intent or declarations of intention forms. These are also sometimes called first papers. Declarations of intent could generally be filed after residing in the United States for a full 2 years. And these forms before 1906 had very little information on them. After 1906, a lot of great information on them. So depending on when your immigrant ancestor came, you might find just a few morsels of information that could be helpful, or you might find a gold mine. Then, once that individual completed their US citizenship acquisition process, you can find what's called a naturalization certificate. These are generally issued 5 years after the Declaration of Intent or first papers. So 7 years or so after the immigrant first set foot on US soil. And again, the earlier in time that this happened, the less information was recorded on the documents. The later in time that this happened, the more information is recorded. You can also find some great information on Jewish ancestors in Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society records, which are available via the American Jewish Historical Society, or AJHS website. So here is an example of a Declaration of Intent form from 1869. So you will see that it will just list the person's name, in this case, Wolf Berman, what country they come from, in this case, Austria, the person's age, 45 years, and it just says that they renounce loyalty to the Emperor of Austria, or whichever foreign power, prince, or sovereignty they emigrated from. So not a whole lot of information here. But then after 1906, you can see this is a Declaration of Intent form from 1907. It lists the person's name, their age, their occupation, skin color, skin complexion, their height, their weight, their hair color, their eye color, other visible distinctive marks. So that might be if they have any scars or tattoos or anything else that's distinctive. It lists the exact town or community where they were born, their exact date of birth, their exact current residence, exactly what city their ship departed from when they emigrated, the name of the ship, and also what town they were living in at the time that they last lived in their previous country. So this is a wealth of information, but only if your ancestor immigrated after 1906. We also recommend looking for military records. So you might be able to find full military service record files. Now, these are more easily accessible the further back in time the service occurred. So if you have an ancestor who, say, served in the US Civil War, you're much more likely to be able to access their full personnel records file than if you have an ancestor who, say, served in World War II. More recent documents tend to be under heavier privacy restrictions. But another great military record for doing Jewish genealogy research are draft cards. Draft cards can offer military service-aged males names, birth dates, birthplace, address, employment situations, name and address of closest living relatives, and even their physical characteristics. And these draft cards are generally available on Ancestry.com, Fold3.com, or if you want to get the original paper records, that would be through the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. And that is kind of a hassle to get an appointment there, but that's only through appointment. Here is an example of a World War II draft card. So this here is a young Jerome Grolman, who would later, some of you might know, become Rabbi Jerome Grolman of United Hebrew Congregation in St. Louis. So he was a native of Baltimore. As you can see here in his World War II draft card, Rabbi Grolman became well known for supporting the civil rights movement. And in 1960, he invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to United Hebrew. So this is the front of his draft card. And here's the back of his draft card, which gives his eye color, hair color, skin complexion, height, weight. It even lists that he wears glasses. We also love newspapers because newspapers provide sometimes information that is not recorded in other documents. Newspapers might give you marriage notices or articles about the weddings, telling you who attended the weddings, sometimes even what kind of cake, what kind of outfits people were wearing at the weddings. We love obituaries. Obituaries can be a gold mine of information about a deceased ancestor. Newspapers might also mention things like property sales and transfers. And newspapers can also mention information about your ancestors' everyday life, about their achievements, about their kind of mundane everyday activities. You can find newspapers on newspapers.com, which is yet another website that St. Louis County Library can give St. Louis County Library cardholders free access to. Or if you have your own accounts on these other websites, you can find other newspapers on websites like genealogybank.com, newspaperarchive.com, and you can also find some newspapers that have not been digitized yet, including some specifically Jewish newspapers on microfilm here at St. Louis County Library H&G. Here's an example of the start of one obituary that appeared in the November 1st, 1903 edition of the St. Louis Republic. This is an obituary for a Simon Pollock. So Dr. Simon Pollock was a doctor in St. Louis, and in 1850, Dr. Pollock helped establish the Missouri Institute for the Education of the Blind. For Jewish genealogy research, we also recommend you always look into the possibility of there being synagogue records. So synagogues generate records for different life events, including brits, b'nai mitzvahs, confirmations, marriages. So you might be able to find ketubah documents, divorces, you might be able to find a get document, and also funeral and gravestone records. For synagogue records, we recommend checking jewishgen.org's Shul Records in America database. We highly recommend for St. Louis-based researchers checking the St. Louis Genealogical Society website. Or if you can't find the relevant synagogue records there, feel free to just ask the synagogue themselves if they are still around. Just phone or email the synagogue office. St. Louis Genealogical Society has marriage records from B'nai Amunah, B'nai El, Berith Shalom Knesset Israel, and Sheремeth, and they also have death records from B'nai Amunah. And here is an example of marriage register entries from B'nai Amunah in 1922. This is, like I said, available on the St. Louis Genealogical Society website. And then you can also find civil vital records. So vital records that were generated by the state government or county or municipality governments. And these were often generated for births, marriages, divorces, or deaths. And a lot of these vital records, especially for St. Louis, are available on Ancestry.com, Family Search, findagrave.com. And if you can't find it there, if it's a more recent record from the last several decades, you might have to contact the State Bureau of Vital Records. So the Missouri State Bureau of Vital Records, for instance, charges, I think, about $15 for each record request. So here is an example of what death records looked like in St. Louis in 1876. While modern death certificates devote an entire page to a deceased person, telling the deceased person's parents' names, giving specific information about their birth dates, etc., death records back in the 19th century just devoted one line to each deceased person. So death records from the 1800s would commonly list the name of the deceased, date of death, marital status, where they were born, the disease they died of, their skin color, the name of their attending physician at time of death, the name of the cemetery they were interred in, and the name of the undertaker or funeral home who was in charge of their remains. Now, we also recommend that researchers be very cognizant of contextual information about geography and the place where your ancestors lived. And this is increasingly important as we move across the ocean and start looking at records from places in Europe or Asia where your ancestors might have originated. So we want patrons to learn more about how the name of their community has changed. We want them to familiarize themselves with the political levels that their ancestors' community existed in, both the levels above their community, so possibly the district or the county or the state or province or country, and then also what levels are below that community, hierarchically speaking. Was that community separated into neighborhoods, or what they call in German Ortsteile? And we also want patrons to pay attention to what the nearby communities are and where nearby county seats or provincial capitals might be, because that is where certain documents might have been certified or notarized. Neighboring towns might be the point of origin for an ancestor's spouse. You can find a lot of information about geography and about places through online resources like Jewish Gen's Communities Database, the Jewish Gen Gazetteer, the German Historic Gazetteer, or Meyer's Gazetteer, which are at gov.genealogy.net and meyersgaz.org, respectively. So here's what Jewish Gen and their community's database looks like. You can search by the name of the community, and the website search function will give your search some flexibility in case there are variations in the spelling or pronunciation of that town name. The search field is this little kind of grayish, purplish rectangle, sort of in the upper right center of the page. Now, once you enter a community name or a town name and you execute the search, here you can see, for example, I have searched for the town of Lengnau in Switzerland, where some of my Jewish ancestors came from. If there are other similarly named or similarly spelled towns, the search results will also show you those. And the nice thing about this database is that it also tracks the districts, provinces, and countries that the town fell under at various points in time. This database will also, off to the far right, give you a link to the number of Jewish Gen Family Finder entries for that town, which is where you can see which other researchers are researching their own ancestors in that same town. Now, in addition to thinking about how the names of communities might have changed, we also want to think about how people's names may have changed or been translated. So given names, first and middle names, were most often named after close relatives in Jewish families. And among Ashkenazi Jews, that's more likely to be deceased relatives, while among Sephardic Jews, it's more likely to be either living or deceased relatives that children are being named after. And here's some examples of how names can change. So they might be directly translated. So individuals with the last name Schwartz might come to the United States and take on the last name of Black, which Schwartz is the German word for black. Or if it is a Sephardic ancestor with the last name of Hassan, Hassan means cantor. So some families with the Hassan surname came to America, and they felt that cantor was a little bit more common, so they changed the name in that way. Names can also change not necessarily based on a direct translation, but just on how they kind of sound. So some Garfinkels would become Garfields. And then this also applies for first names as well. So of course, a Shlomo from the old country might become Solomon or Saul in the new country. Rivka becomes Rebecca, Leb, Lewis. And one myth that we often have to debunk, especially for folks who are just beginning their family history journey, is the myth that names were changed by officials at Ellis Island. So Ellis Island, of course, did not open until the early 1900s. Before that, there was no Ellis Island. People were coming, if they were coming through New York, they were coming via the Immigration Center at Castle Garden, or perhaps through Boston, Baltimore, New Orleans, Philadelphia. So historians are not totally sure where or when exactly this myth started that Ellis Island officials were changing people's names left and right. But funny enough, one of the earliest examples historians can find is the scene from the 1974 film The Godfather Part 2, in which an immigration official at Ellis Island unilaterally changes Vito Andolini's last name to Corleone. So some historians have theorized that it may be the case that many of these family legends about Ellis Island official name changes are actually a false mass memory from people who saw this film in the 1970s. In reality, immigrants generally started going by new names of their own will, of their own free will and volition, and they generally started that sometime after they arrived in the US. And there was often a lot of fluidity in how immigrants spelled their name, or even in which name or which nickname they used. And that fluidity was especially in the first few years or even the first few decades of them having settled in the United States. Now, as we are looking for records about Jewish ancestors in Europe and Asia, we also have to look for records relating to the Nazi regime and administration, records relating to the Shoah, and the concentration camp records. Many of these records are being digitized and can now be seen on Ancestry, in their military records collections, such as casualties and prisoner rolls collections, on fold3.com, and in the websites of the Arolsen Archives, the United States Holocaust Museum, and Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem especially is an important website and an important organization because they are essentially trying to document every single human victim of the Shoah. So here's an example of a record for an individual who died at Dachau in 1940. These are the types of records that you can obtain through websites like Arolsen, Yad Vashem, US Holocaust Museum. As with many concentration camp records, this lists the victim's name, their birth date, city of birth, sex, occupation, marital status, religion, different camps that they passed through. In this instance, this man named Ewald Kurtzel started at Sachsenhausen concentration camp and then was transferred to Dachau. And at the top of the record, it lists the type of prisoner, because people were placed into concentration camps for ostensibly for different reasons. In this case, this individual was categorized as a Häftling, which generally means a political prisoner, and indicates that he was probably deemed to maybe be a socialist or part of a resistance movement against the Nazis. Then there are also Yizkor books. So in the aftermath of the Holocaust, survivors got together and they did oral history. They found whatever surviving paper documents they could, and they tried to put it all down in writing while they still could. These are Yizkor books, and some of them are available on Jewish Gen on their website's Yizkor Book Project page. And you can also find some Yizkor books available in person here at St. Louis County Library's H&G. Here you can see a screenshot from our H&G website listing some of the different towns for which we have Yizkor books. This is an example of one of the Yizkor books in our collection, and this is the Yizkor book for Galicia. Like many of these, this one is printed in Hebrew, so the front cover starts from the right side of the book, or what we English speakers would think of as the quote-unquote back of the book. And the text of the book works its way left. You can see on the cover here, if you can read Hebrew, it says Sefer Galicia. So Sefer, of course, means book, and Galicia refers to the locale that this book covers. And this is an image of the interior of this Yizkor book. So you can see it's printed in Hebrew. It oftentimes transliterates German or Polish or even Arabic words and names into Hebrew, which adds another layer of complexity. So If you are fluent in Hebrew, this is a great resource. Otherwise, you might need to brush up on your Hebrew if you want to use these physical books. But Baruch Hashem, Jewish Gen to the rescue. So Jewish Gen is in the process of transliterating, translating, and then digitizing as many Yizkor books as they can so that people for whom English is their first language are able to read and access them online. And so here you can see a list of some of the Yizkor books that Jewish Gen workers and volunteers are still working on and their progress with each of those books. And here is one of the Yizkor books that Jewish Gen has digitized. You can see they do a really nice job of hyperlinking the table of contents, making it easy to read, searchable. So highly recommend checking out Yizkor books on Jewish Gen's website. Now, eventually, even if you're able to get back to the village or the community your ancestor originated in Europe or Asia, you will eventually hit a brick wall. Some brick walls are permanent because the records simply no longer exist, but many brick walls can be broken through. And so we always tell folks, never assume that village or synagogue records don't exist. There is kind of a false view among many individuals that all of the village Jewish records, synagogue records were wiped out in the early 20th century. And that is not true. Many records survived, and many records to this day are still being discovered and rescued and digitized. And you can find some of these records on websites like Jewish Gen and Roots to Roots. A lot of Jewish Eurasian village and synagogue records are being rediscovered and preserved all the time. So keep checking back. And always, always, always ask, ask, ask. Don't just assume that if you can't find it through a simple Google search that the record doesn't exist. Ask other researchers who you know are researching the same ancestors or the same geographic area. Reach out to libraries in places like Europe or Western Asia. Reach out to universities. Reach out to historical societies over there. Oftentimes, those on-the-ground researchers and professionals have insider information that is not on any of the websites that we can access here in the United States, and they can point you in the right direction. And of course, if you find those old village records or synagogue records that pertain to your ancestors, you might have to deal not only with Hebrew, but handwritten Hebrew. Luckily, there are resources out there. I have included some links in the handout to understanding and reading both handwritten Hebrew and cursive Hebrew as well. And it is okay and encouraged to look offline and think outside the box when doing genealogy research. Just because something does not exist on Ancestry doesn't mean that it doesn't exist at all. Not all records have been digitized, and not all records are online. In fact, a lot of researchers believe that the vast majority of currently existing records are not online. Only a minority of records are currently on the internet. So never be afraid to call or write or email local institutions in the area or the community where you are researching. So for instance, do you think maybe that your ancestor was buried in a certain cemetery, but you can't find them on findagrave.com? Contact the cemetery's physical office or the sexton of the cemetery. Really think outside of the box about what kinds of records or documents your ancestor might have generated. For example, I found my great-great-great-grandfather's medical files from the 1930s by simply reaching out to the hospital and saying, my ancestor was treated at your hospital in the 1930s. Is there any chance that his medical records still exist? They went into the basement, and on microfilm, they found my great-great-great-grandfather's medical records, which told me everything I ever wanted to know about my great-great-great-grandfather and all of his medical conditions and some stuff I did not want to know. But it also told me information that was relevant to my family history research I would have never otherwise discovered, like the fact that he and his wife had had a miscarriage at one point. And always look on the peripheries. Try not to get tunnel vision solely looking for your direct ancestors. Look for your ancestors' siblings, your ancestors' cousins. Who were your ancestors' neighbors? Look in the censuses. Did your ancestors' family live in the same household as another family? Who were the witnesses on your ancestors' marriage records, on your ancestors' naturalization record? Look in the directories and the censuses to see who has the same last name as your ancestor and lives in the same area. Because usually immigrants would settle in a certain neighborhood or a certain city for a reason, because they already had relatives who already lived there. And don't be afraid to compare notes with other researchers. So message fellow researchers through Ancestry, through findagrave.com, through Jewish Gen's Family Finder. Is really helpful for not duplicating efforts and reinventing the wheel. So we, of course, need to balance not unnecessarily duplicating efforts. If somebody else out there has already found the document that you're looking for, it will save you a lot of time and energy and possibly money to get it straight from them rather than trying to re-find it. But also you need to balance that with taking other researchers' claims with healthy skepticism. Even seasoned researchers can have incorrect information. So you want to take whatever other researchers have put online with a grain of salt and see if you can verify it by finding the original evidence or documentation to back that up. And then lastly, we encourage everyone to do DNA testing, especially testing your oldest living family members while it is still possible, because once they are gone, their DNA is gone. You will not be able to get that DNA anymore once they have passed away. So here's a little bit of terminology. We recommend starting with what's called autosomal DNA testing. This is the DNA that we inherit from both mom and dad, from both Bubi and Zaidi. And it is the DNA that tells you something about which countries your ancestors came from. And this is the type of DNA testing most people do through services like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage. Then you can also, if you want to dig deeper into your solely paternal lineage, you can do Y-DNA tests. So Y-DNA is a specific chunk of DNA that gets inherited with your autosomal DNA, but it's only passed from fathers to sons. So it traces very well with patrilineal surnames. You can also test for mitochondrial DNA or mDNA, and that is passed from mothers to children. So that's great for tracing maternal lines. There's also something called xDNA. So we all inherit an X chromosome. Males inherit an X and a Y. Females inherit two X chromosomes. But xDNA cannot be passed from fathers to sons because fathers pass Y chromosomes to their sons. So if you share xDNA with somebody, and you can check via GEDmatch, uploading your DNA data to GEDmatch, whether you do or do not share xDNA with somebody. If you do, then that narrows down the possible relational routes through which you can be related. And H&G here at St. Louis County Library is happy to help you navigate the DNA testing process and give you information and resources on how to test and how to analyze your DNA test results. We also recommend a Facebook group called Jewish DNA for Genetic Genealogy and Family Research. And oftentimes, genetic genealogy or DNA research can be the only way to break through genealogical brick walls where paper documents have run dry.